It's a brilliant sunny day here in Seoul, Korea. Last week I spoke about clear, high autumn sky. It seems such a day today. And today here in Korea is an important holiday, which is the holiday for the founding of the Korean nation. But it is actually called 개천절, which means the day that heaven opened. Presumably it's the founding of the Korean nation in ancient Korea, and in roughly 2333 BC, official founding day. But in actual fact, if you look at the historical record carefully, the day that heaven opened, this day, is actually earlier than the founding of the ancient Korea. It was earlier by 124 years. Specifically, it's said to be 2557 BC, when the father of Dangun, who founded the Korean nation, whose name was Hwanung, a divine being, came down to earth, incarnated on earth. So the divine being Hwanung presumably came down from heaven, and 124 years later his son Dangun founded the ancient Korea. It is said that Hwanung came down to earth upon a mountain, and the mountain was called Taebaek Mountain, but presumably it actually is Paekdu Mountain. Taebaek Mountain, Taebaek means white mountain. So historians think that it was actually Paekdu Mountain, which is the highest mountain in Korea, which right now is in North Korea. It is said that he came down upon the highest mountain, and also up underneath a tree at the highest point of the mountain. So the meaning of this is that he came down upon the highest mountain next to a sacred tree. But we encounter a similar symbol in the story of Moses, when he went to the high mountain, and there was a sacred tree which was described as the burning bush. And there Moses, in that story, made contact with God. What this means is that the high mountain and the sacred tree are both symbols. Could it be that Hwanung really came down upon the top of the Paekdu Mountain, where it's all snowy and very cold? Presumably, if he were to come down, maybe he would have chosen a little nicer climate location. So the meaning of this is that it's symbolic. The mountain and the sacred tree are symbols. They're symbols of the highest place in consciousness. So the meaning of this is that divine being came into form, into the earth, beginning at the highest point in consciousness. So the meaning of this is that it is at the place of highest pneumoplasm that spirit or divine being enters into human consciousness. I spoke last week of beginning from the altar a new beginning. From the center of the holy place, a new beginning. What is the center of the holy place? Specifically, what is the altar? Not the form of the altar, but the vibrational nature of the altar, which is the center of the holy place. It's that place where there's a contact between heaven and earth and between the human form and divine being. The place that Hanung, divine being incarnated, is that place. The place of the crossover or contact point between the divine and the human. So, where the divine incarnates into the human form, that place is the place that results in the tree of life, the sacred tree, which is the tree or the place from which life, new life, continually is born. So the meaning of the tree of life is the emergence, continual emergence of vital, vibrant new life because of the contact with the divine. The tree of life is present in symbol throughout all of humanity. Sometimes it's called the tree of the universe or the world tree. I think many of you have probably watched the movie Avatar, and in that movie there's portrayed the world tree or the universal tree, the tree of life, in a very beautiful illustrated way. In Korea, until not very long ago, in many villages, not just as an abstract symbol, but there was a protective and sacred tree in that village very often. So such a tree is often present, not often perhaps, but in some villages is still present in Korea that are several hundred years old. And the village protects the tree and does not allow it to be cut down. The meaning of the protective or sacred tree has tended to degenerate into just a protective tree or just a sacred tree. But its deepest meaning is the contact point with the divine, which brings life continually. So what was the place where the Buddha had his enlightenment? It was under the Bodhi tree. Bodhi, which is Bodhi in Korean, means awakening. It's a tree of awakening. The meaning of the Bodhi tree is that under the tree of enlightenment, the Buddha came into the experience of the self beyond self. Wouldn't it be nice to find that tree? Where is that tree? Where is that darn tree? Need to find this Bodhi tree, this sacred tree under which Hanung incarnated. Of course, through modern technology, through genetic manipulation, there's an attempt by human beings through technology to find eternal life. Where is this tree? The Bodhi tree, the universal tree, the tree of life. Shindansu, where Hanung came into the earth. That tree is within us. It's not very far. It's not many kilometers away. Is it a few millimeters away? In Korea, there's a custom of burnt or custom of ancient ancestor worship, which is called 제사, ancestor ceremony, where food and incense is offered for one's ancestors. But in Korea, the custom has largely degenerated into ancestor worship, but it was not ancestor worship originally. It was a ceremony of worship and offering to heaven. But this matter of offering of food to heaven, would heaven like that? Pears and apples and persimmons and the original and true meaning of the offering upon the altar in this way was not the offering of food. The food became the substitute, but it was the offering of self. The meaning of that true worship upon the altar and the offering upon the altar was the offering of all that one is in human capacity to divine being. The food was a substitute for that. From the vantage point of heaven, the degeneration of the custom is probably not very happy event. Instead of one's offering one's all upon the altar of the divine, offering a bunch of food instead. But looking more kindly, the food can be a symbol of one's all. In the olden times, when the best of the harvest was offered, that could be the symbol of one's all, in fact. I suppose depending on the consciousness of the person, it can symbolize merely form, or it can symbolize the offering of one's all to center, to source, to the divine. When one has surrendered one's all, and in that process was released of self, and one comes into center. There we discover our timeless self in full surrender as we enter into the center of our being. We discover a self beyond self. What we discover is the selfless self. The day Hwanung came down into the world is supposed to be said to be 4,500 years ago. The day Hwanung, the divine being that opened heaven and was the beginning of Korea, was now 4,500 years ago. The day that heaven opened is not in the past. The place where heaven opens is a place that is outside of time, is now. The place where heaven comes into this world is a place where time has disappeared. Just as 4,500 years ago, Hanung opened heaven. But also, Jesus opened heaven 2,000 years ago. The purpose of each one of us is to open heaven. As we surrender that which is the most precious to us, and that which is the most fearful to us, that we want to avoid. As we abide in that place, the pulsation of life naturally takes us. If there is a response in us, naturally takes us into this place of center and timelessness. That which is the most precious to us is that which we want to possess and hang on to. That which we most fear is that which we want to avoid. As long as we are holding on to these two things, even if there is response in us, these two things prevent the natural pulsation of life and our response from bringing us to center. For people, I, me, self are very important. This self of such great importance, if we take a moment to observe, honestly, we recognize it's a pitiful self. Pitiful self means fearful self, separated self. But we make all manners of effort to maintain this pitiful self. And of course in Korea, people try all manners of things to add a master's degree to it, or a PhD to it. Cosmetic surgery, all manners of things to add to the pitiful self.
Or righteousness.
Jesus said, "He who loses himself shall find himself." The meaning of that is that as we surrender the pitiful self, we find our true self. To find one's true self means to stand in the place of selflessness, such that we stand in the crossover point between heaven and earth. As we stand in the place of selfless surrender to the divine, in the crossover point, we discover self-divine, that timeless self I am. Another word for that is the Father. We discover the Father within. We come to stand in the place where time has disappeared. Hanung is not a being that came 4,500 years ago, and it is a being in memory and history. Hanung is who I am now as I stand in the crossover point. So then, when is Ketchunger, the day that heaven opened? The day of heaven opening is a day that when self has disappeared. It is for this purpose that we came. To dissolve the self that has degenerated on earth. To bring forth the self that I am in truth. When we know and have come to the place of dissolution of self, we bring Hanung. Hanung is the source self that we are. When we do this, we bring the world tree, the tree of life, into our personal lives and into our worlds. Another symbol for this place of contact with the divine, with source, with the universe in Egypt in history was the capstone of the golden capstone of the pyramid, the contact point with the divine. I pondered a little bit, not that seriously, but I wondered why a stone was used as a symbol in that region for the contact point with the divine. I suppose a possibility is that it was because it was a desert and there were not many trees. Several weeks ago, I gave a service that was titled Surrender Results. Be love. Surrender results means surrender self, which is attachment to results. It's only as we surrender attachment to results and the self that is attached in that way that we can be our true self, love. Jesus consistently stood in this place where attachment to outer results was released, and thus he stood in a place of where time had disappeared and the contact with the divine was consistently preserved. For me, these past 2.5 months were a truly precious and important time. For me, these 2.5 months were a time of releasing attachment to all that was precious, as well as the desire to avoid all that was of concern or fear. When we have lost all in the way of attachment, we find that we have gained all. The meaning of finding one's true self, timeless, true self, is the finding of one who doesn't need anything more outer. Of course, in the process of the dissolution of self and the discovery of deeper self. There's a fear or concern that comes up. It's like, oh, I'm disappearing. But what is the concern is not so much the disappearing of self, but it's seen primarily as a disappearing of all the things outwardly that were important to me. And that is what one has to be willing to go through. That it's okay for all that was outer, that was important, to disappear, to dissolve. But what this process actually involves is that the losing of all that seems outer leads to the gaining of the sacred tree, the tree of life. So what happens if one loses everything outwardly but discovers the tree of life? What's the result of that? The meaning of that result, the loss of all that seems important outwardly, but the gaining of the tree of life, is that from that place of the tree of life, the world tree, the Bodhi tree, the sacred tree, all things begin. So it means that, in fact, one has gained all, because one has gained the tree of life. Another meaning of this is that as we lose the tree of judgment, of good and evil, this I want to keep, this I want to avoid. As we lose that tree of judgment of good and evil, we gain the tree of life. In the place where self with small s is lost, there stands the universal tree, the tree of life. And there all things begin. And it's in the place where the sacred tree stands in the instead of self. There a new world begins. The true offering on the altar is the release of one's attachment self. So let us have true ceremony of offering upon the altar. All our fears, all our wants. All our wants and all our fears offered upon the altar, raised to heaven, so that the fire of who we truly are enters into this world through us. The only way that we can continue the work begun by Hwanung, the work opened by Jesus, is as we offer ourselves in this way. the worshiping of Jesus as little self-centered beings is without any meaning. The way that we can truly worship Jesus is as we surrender all our wants and all our fears and come to our true selves. And as we do this, we become kings and queens of heaven. So it is that as we do this, Jesus, the Lord of Lords, is loved and served as the King of the kings and queens that we are. So on this day, when heaven opens, not October 3, 2021, but in this moment where time has disappeared, let us bring through us the opening of heaven and true beginnings. There is something that those who seek to hang on to the small self don't know. What they don't know is that that small self is already ordained to be burnt, whether one likes it or not. So it is that I suggest burning voluntarily rather than involuntarily. It's a lot less hot. What we discover in the process of the burning as we surrender and voluntarily enter the fire is that we are the fire that is doing the burning. There's a process of transition between feeling the burning and being the burning. In the world, the pressure is rising and the temperature is getting hotter. While that comes to some first, but it's coming to all. As I've said before, this is a time when there's a harvest taking place with great velocity of all that has been sown personally and collectively. So I suggest we all give up slowly coming into our true selves. Velocity is increasing. Let's burn quickly and be the world sacred tree. 감사합니다, 여러분들.